Leave the vase broken. The only thing we had in common was that we both didn't love me. You by never staying, me by never leaving. So, this is a poem by Melinda Rice, and I'm going to use it to make a point in just a moment. Before I do, you might be wondering, what do I think of this poem? Or if you've seen my videos, you probably already have a good idea. I don't love this poem. As with many shorter poems, I'm not sure if it justifies its length. The first two lines do make a slight impact, I'll give it that, and to be honest, I actually think this is a pretty effective use of a line break in the way that it prompts us to keep reading, conceals information, and hits us with a bit of a 1-2 punch. But otherwise, there's not a ton of substance here. I feel like I've seen this sentiment done better in several other poems. With this one, I kind of just think, and from there feel tempted to move on. So you might now be wondering, if the poem doesn't elicit much of a reaction from me, why would I even include it in this video? Well, it's not the poem itself that captures my interest, but the response to it. See, this was posted to r/poetry on October 1st, 2025, and as soon as I saw it, I knew what the response would be. This comment reads, TLDR, add line breaks if you truly wish to break me. Another one says, at this point, I feel like these poems are so narcissistically unskilled that even bothering to critique them at all gives them a veil of legitimacy. They don't deserve the breath it takes. And this one reads, cringe Instagram poem. Like I said, these responses were not at all unexpected. I've started to notice a trend on r/poetry and in a lot of online poetry circles in general. Let me give you another more poignant example. This piece is by J. Warren Welch and was posted on September 29th, 2025. This is poetry. Many years ago, I had an enlightenment experience where I understood how connected we all are. When the acid wore off, I realized I don't really want to be connected to most of you motherfuckers. Much like the first poem we saw, I don't have much of a reaction to this piece. I do think there's an okay humor to it. I like when the acid wore off. I think that's a funny reveal, again, heightened by the line breaks. What's more, the conclusion is also kind of funny. But again, as with Rice's poem, I just kind of think, and then move on. On a more critical note, I also don't really feel the poem lives up to its title. Poetry that is itself about poetry is called Ars Poetica, which literally means the art of poetry. It comes from Horace's Ars Poetica, wherein Horace literally educates readers about the art of poetry and drama. If you encountered this poem divorced from the title, would you really think it's a poem about poetry? And I can kind of see what Welch is going for in the sense that I do believe the purpose of poetry, and of all literature for that matter, is empathy, is to connect us to one another. But even so, the text just doesn't feel like it aptly tackles the title. Hopefully you get a better sense of what I mean by comparing this piece to another Ars Poetica. This is Arte Poetica by Vicente Huidobro, translated from Spanish by me. That the verse may be like a key which opens 1,000 doors. A page falls, something passes flying. As much as the eyes see, may it be created, and the soul of the listener stay stirred. Invent new worlds and care for your word. The adjective, when it gives not life, kills. We are in the cycle of nerves. The muscle hangs, like a souvenir in the museums, but we are no less strong for that. The true power resides in the head. Why do you sing the rose, O poets? Make it flourish in the poem. Everything under the sun lives, only for us. The poet is a small god. Chalk up any problems you have with this poem to my translation. I promise it's a lot better in Spanish. In Spanish, Huidobro is being very clever with his double meanings. For example, the word hoja, which I translated as page, also means leaf, which emphasizes the poet's connection to the natural world. Then there's the line that reads, como recuerdo en los museos, which I translated as like a souvenir in the museums. The word recuerdo can mean souvenir, but it could also mean memory or artifact or even something else beyond that. It's fascinating trying to decide which one he means. But even if you don't like this poem, you can't deny that it's clearly a poem about poetry, right? Huidobro is clearly saying something about the artistry behind the form. So in any case, I don't love Welch's poem. Like Rice's, I find it mostly lacks substance. It elicits a very light laugh from me, but not much more. Still, once again, I knew what the response would be from Redditors. Boomer tier meme plus smash the return key equals poetry, apparently. I often wonder how so many people who claim to like poetry think that line breaks can be made at random. Insta poetry for edgy boomers. All they do, the great poets that they are, is break sentences into lines that make sense, and sometimes don't. Now, look, it might seem kind of hypocritical of me to make a video like this. After all, I sort of made a name for myself on YouTube by criticizing poetry just like this. But if I'm being honest, I'm kind of just getting tired of this discourse. Much like poetry itself, I can't say I really enjoy it when a comment section is predictable. I see posts like these pop up on r/poetry, and I already know what the comments will say. But before we really get into it, I first want to cut the commenters some slack. I like r/poetry. I think in general it is a very reliable place to find good poems. I've been introduced to poets and individual poems that I really grew to love through this subreddit. I will also say I completely understand people's frustrations with poems that seem low effort. I genuinely believe everyone on r/poetry loves the medium, at least on some level. I've always said that poetry is a very careful, very intentional art form. So when you see a decision that seems arbitrary, that might feel like a slap in the face to the artistry. I think r/poetry users get offended, whether as avid poetry readers or aspiring poets themselves. But isn't it also kind of a slap in the face to presuppose arbitrariness on the author's part? I think merely calling a feature of a poem random is a bit of a deflection, and a deflection I've probably committed before. Readers and critics can certainly explain why particular decisions on the author's part feel arbitrary, but that still demands engaging with the work rather than writing it off wholesale. Also, regarding arbitrariness, I want to quote author Bruce Holland Rogers as included in the Rose Medal Press Field Guide to Writing Flash Fiction. This is an excellent craft book. Even if you're not a flash writer, I would highly recommend it. I will be quoting from it multiple times in this video. But anyway, regarding a form called the Fibonacci sonnet, Rogers writes, "Of course, there is no real point to this fussy attempt to get close to the golden ratio any more than the rules of a verse sonnet specify 14 lines and not 15 or 13. And he makes a good point. When you get right down to it, all rules in poetry or literature are kind of arbitrary. Language itself, the very words we invented, can be arbitrary just as well. But we'll talk more about that later. And like I said, maybe this all sounds hypocritical coming from me. I know I probably sound like a pretentious gatekeeper all the time. But my real problem is when people try to say something like, "This isn't poetry," or "This is just a sentence with line breaks," or take this comment under a Rupi Kaur poem. This is a poetry subreddit. Why are we being tormented with this pathetic calumny of the very definition of poetry? It has no punctuation, no start or end of sentences. It feels like a blasphemous butchery of English made for people with a very shallow grasp of the language. I would rather prefer nursery rhymes over this vomitus. I don't like Rupi Kaur either, but who made you the authority on the definition of poetry? Also, what are these constraints? Punctuation? Starts and ends of sentences? Are those things necessities in poetry? You guys mind if I read a couple poems real quick? Injust by E. Cummings. Injust spring, when the world is mudlicious. The little lame balloon man whistles far and wee, and Eddie and Bill come running from marbles and piracies, and it's spring, when the world is puddle wonderful. The queer old balloon man whistles far and wee, and Betty and Isbel come dancing from hopscotch and jump rope, and it's spring, and the goat-footed balloon man whistles far and wee. And this one is My Father Used to Be Selfish by Victoria Chang. My father used to be selfish. He used to like fish. Now he can't identify fish. I wish I were selfish. I used to be selfish on some days. I think how easy to sell fish on a boat in another ocean, shucking, cussing some days. I think how easy to finish what I started to be the boss, to write letters, to let him work for me, to promote him, to demote her, to protect him, to eject her, to read of developmental needs, of opportunities, to be important, portable skills from company to company, portable like a lunchbox. My 4-year-old wants a Scooby-Doo lunchbox. Maybe she can solve the mystery of the missing mother, missing woman, missing boss. The mystery of the missing father. Oh, my mistake. These aren't poems, are they? Seeing as they don't use traditional punctuation or delineate where their sentences start and end. Give me a break. By the way, you should definitely read The Boss by Victoria Chang. Great book. Okay, so maybe we should have a chat about what poetry actually is, yeah? But the difficult thing about that is, well, for any possible constraint I could try to tie to poetry, there's almost always a counterexample. For instance, I could say that poetry should have to rhyme, but there's countless examples of poems that don't. I could say that poetry should have a certain rhythm that prose doesn't, but there are plenty of prose pieces that are more rhythmic than some of the poetry I've read. Do you see the problem? Poetry is a flexible genre, too flexible for its own good, I would argue. I just barely cited E. E. Cummings. Could we possibly have a poet like Cummings if not for poetry's flexibility? Or, as my viewers know, one of my poetry hot takes is my lackluster feelings towards Charles Bukowski. But even I wouldn't dare say his poems don't count as poetry just because they're, on average, simpler than a lot of other poems you could read. In one of my writing workshops in my MFA program, poet Richard Jackson asked us the difference between prose and poetry. I deferred to my favorite definition, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's. To paraphrase, prose is words in their best order, while poetry is the best words in the best order. But Richard, for his part, disagreed, and said that the only difference was that poetry had line breaks. And when you think about it, yeah, that does seem to be the only difference. You don't see anyone use line breaks in prose, right? If you do, then what you usually have is a novel in verse, which still counts as poetry. Unfortunately for Rick, though, there are still exceptions to that rule, seeing as prose poetry exists. And there aren't any line breaks in prose poetry. That's what makes it prose poetry. I feel like the only true factor that can define a poem is its use of text. Then again, there may be exceptions to that too. What's more, if all a poem needs to be a poem is the use of text, then what actually separates poetry from prose? That question becomes especially complicated when you consider the existence of flash fiction and prose poetry. These are both two art forms defined by their prosaic structure and their brevity. You might already have some ideas in your head regarding what separates these two, for example, a plot. And author Kim Ching-ki might agree with you. Quote, "In simple, general terms, I believe that a prose poem is more about language and poetics, whereas a flash carries more narrative and story," end quote. But what's funny is fellow Flash writer Robert Olin Butler might actually disagree with that assertion, saying that a Flash story does not, in fact, have to have a plot in the traditional sense. Quote, "To be brief, it is a short story and not a prose poem because it has at its center a character who yearns." Fiction is a temporal art form. Poetry can choose to ignore the passage of time, for there is a clear sense of a poem being an object, composed densely of words existing in space. This is true even when the length of the line is not an objectifying part of the form, as in a prose poem. And a poem need not overtly concern itself with a human subject. But when you have a human being centrally present in a literary work and you let the line length run on and you turn the page, you are, as they say in a long storytelling tradition, upon a time. It has been traditional to think that a story has to have a plot while a poem does not. Plot, in fact, is yearning, challenged, and thwarted. A short story in its brevity may not have a fully developed plot, but it must have the essence of a plot. Yearning. End quote. What's more, if you're a poetry lover, you can probably very easily think of a poem that has both a plot and a character who yearns. I'm going to present one to you shortly, but let's keep talking about some of the distinctions authors might try to make. Author Lex Williford writes, "For me, flash fiction usually begins in its image and ends with something akin to the lyricism of poetry. But what sets it apart, say, from a prose poem is that the story must turn dramatically, must have a complete reversal of some sort. A surprise so stunning and rich that it could only happen in a story, and that reversal is usually carried by powerful and unforgettable images. Like a wood splinter under a thumbnail, such images are barbed and remain inextricable, no matter how long one might probe beneath bleeding flesh to dig them out." Rusty Barnes adds, "This is one way to tell the difference between a prose poem and a piece of short fiction. Where the description is amped up at the expense of advancing a storyline, chances are you're looking at a prose poem. Of course, a prose poem can advance a storyline, and a story must rely on description too. Ain't equivocation grand? The point being, description for its own sake is a hallmark of poetic technique, in and of itself, whereas in a story, the description must serve a purpose other than calling attention to itself as an object. Meanwhile, what actually makes a good flash story in the first place? Pamela Casto explains, Flash fiction is difficult if not impossible to define and should be allowed to remain so because this type of writing is protean. As with Proteus of ancient myth, it takes on various shapes and uses different strategies to achieve its goals. These shapes and strategies are too dissimilar to confine flash fiction to a too narrow or too specific definition. These short stories are endlessly metamorphosing as myths themselves. But I would tentatively define the best flash fiction as short stories that manage to reveal the hidden, accentuate the subtle, and highlight the seemingly insignificant. Such stories allow readers, as William Blake said in another context, to see the world in a grain of sand. The best offer insight and understanding of the human experience as they deepen and broaden awareness in a short space of text. While the stories as a whole often provide a quick flash of revelation, they're also read by serious readers as slowly and carefully as they might read good poetry. These highly charged stories often go well beyond their surface details and manage to expand in the reading. It's significant that Casto uses a quote from a poem in her definition of flash. But on top of that, many authors in the Rose Medal Press Field Guide to Writing Flash Fiction emphasize the importance of white space and brevity. The space at the end of a flash story is vital, and brevity is the name of the game when it comes to flash. Every word has to matter. There is no room for superfluousness. As Jennifer Pironi explains, excellent flash fiction displays a true mastery of language. Not only must the writer be precise, but she must also engage the reader in a response to the work. As in a sonnet, every word in every line matters in the mathematical sense. Further, as with poetry more generally, I see excellent writers as having a certain flair for words, a real intent to use them to provoke and, dare I say, surprise the reader. Now, keeping all of that in mind, let me show you this. Wonder Woman by Ada Limon. Standing at the swell of the muddy Mississippi, after the urgent care doctor had just said, well, sometimes shit happens, I fell fast and hard for New Orleans all over again. Pain pills swirling in the purse, along with a spell for later. It's taken a while for me to admit I am in a raging battle with my body, a spinal column 35 degrees bent, vertigo that comes and goes like a DC Comics villain nobody can kill. Invisible pain is both a blessing and a curse. You always look so happy, said a stranger once as I shifted to my good side, grinning. But that day, alone on the riverbank, brass blaring from the steamboat Natchez, out of the corner of my eye I saw a girl, maybe half my age, dressed, for no apparent reason, as Wonder Woman. She strutted by in all her strength and glory, invincible, eternal, and when I stood to clap, because who wouldn't have, she bowed and posed like she knew I needed a myth. A woman, by a river, indestructible. First, let me just say I love poetry like this. Poetry that takes seemingly random or insignificant events and gives meaning to them. But second, does this poem not contain all the elements these Flash authors just said the best Flash stories display? A plot with a beginning, a middle, and an end, mastery of language, strong images, a turn, a character who yearns, etc. And look, I'm not trying to say the Flash authors are just flat out wrong. I honestly do think, for the most part, they are generally correct. Poets are more concerned with language and description, while prose authors are more concerned with story. But like I said, this is the problem, the fact that there is always an exception. So what do we do about that? Well, why do we have to do anything? Flash authors are already aware of how similar a Flash story is to a prose poem. I mean, look at how many of them mentioned it in this book. The book's editor, Tara L. Massey, even quotes Irving Howe directly in the introduction, who said, "Flash fiction is fiercely condensed, almost like a lyric poem. It explodes itself to a single, overpowering incident. It bears symbolic weight." Even in Howe's definition of flash fiction, he compared it to a poem. I'm not saying we should just throw convention to the wind, although there is a time and a place for that. Massey quotes Irving Howe again and adds her own commentary, writing, "As Irving Howe instructs, divisions of genre serve a purpose somewhat like a scaffolding, useful as preliminaries, but in the end to be discarded. We hope you will feel free to discard what does not sit right with you creatively, but that you will first consider it all." And that, I think, is where a lot of Instapoets fall short. It seems to me that they haven't truly considered all that they're rejecting. Granted, I could be wrong, there might be many Insta poets out there who are very well read, but I think you tend to write in the same vein of what you read, so I don't know, call it putting two and two together. Still, I think it's unfair to say that Insta poetry doesn't count as poetry. To quote Massey one more time, "To this day, the rhetorical arguments continue on the differences between the prose poem and the short short. I don't believe the debate can or will ever end. The wall between these forms is too thin." I honestly think the debate about prose poetry versus flash fiction is very interesting, but only on a perfunctory level. On the craft level, I don't know that it does us much good. Does drawing lines in the sand between form and genre really make us better writers? And what's the point of drawing those lines when, as Massey says, the lines seem too thin? Why try to put art in a box? I'm going to read 2 more quotes from the Rose Medal Press Field Guide to Writing Flash Fiction, and I am sorry, they are long quotes, but this will be the last time I quote from the book, I promise. These last 2 are again from Kim Chinky. That distinction between prose poems and flashes could also depend on the observer's eyes, the timing and mood, the light of that one moment. It would be easier if it were about biology, with dominant and recessive genes, each piece mapped out on a chart, but then what would be the control, the median, the standard deviation? It begins to lean towards science or math, away from those elements that make language so affecting. How then can one arrive at a concrete way of distinguishing flash fiction from prose poetry? If looking for specifics, like whether a piece has more flash tendencies or more sightings of a prose poem, one could write many interesting dissertations on this topic, charting out and color-coding the black or gray or white. But all in all, they are simply interchangeable. Each can be the other. They exist, and that's what is most important. So I recommend getting out the pen or getting to the computer. Start with a purple sun or a man climbing in a window and write, and then see where it takes you. Exactly. Stop worrying about the lines between form and genre and just get to writing. But we've strayed a bit from where we started. What about discourse? What about the, dare I say, snobbish trends in spaces like r/poetry? How should we engage with poems we perceive as uninspired or even lazy? Well, my first thought would be to simply not engage with them at all, but I'm not quite sure if that's the right move. The reason Insta poems tend to do pretty well on r/poetry is because they hit Reddit's main explore page, and even people who generally dislike poetry can digest it and give it a little upvote. I talked about this way back in my first Ruby Core video, but that's the appeal of Insta poetry in the first place. People get to enjoy poetry, but without any of the complications instilled within them, likely from public education. So with that in mind, I think the best thing to do with poetry you dislike is, well, engage with it, but in a smart, kind, and understandable way. For example, on the Rice post, one user left the following comment. The title of "Leave the Vase Broken" is evocative. I feel like I'd rather see this pushed a bit further. Actually, it might be better off, if it wants to be a short poem, to take off the last 2 lines that kind of over-explain the bit, in my opinion. It's clear why this resonates with people. It feels very much like the kind of post that would go viral on Tumblr or get posted with a picture of a sad anime girl in the rain or something. In its attempt at universality, some readers are going to feel quite alienated, myself included. I want to know more. I want to know why the vase is in this poem, because that's a violent image, a broken vase just left alone, and yet that final line is just so stagnant. Could do a bit more if this is the point of view from the metaphorical vase, about how it contains things and can't anymore. I don't know, just doesn't do much for me at this point. What an excellent comment. It lays out the user's problems with the poem in a strong and sensical way. Now, should anyone interact with this post themselves, they might better understand why a lot of poetry fans have a problem with it. This is a much more informative, constructive comment than what I usually expect from posts like these. In the replies, the user even explained that poetry is their field, and they want to give others the benefit of the doubt when not privy to their process. But they also discovered that Rice's poem may have been AI generated in the first place, so perhaps it didn't merit the dissection, or maybe that's exactly why posts like these do merit dissection. I don't know, you tell me what you think. On Welch's poem, one commenter rewrote the piece, and you can debate how productive that is, but then they explained the strengths and weaknesses of the line breaks in Welch's version compared to what they were going for with their own version. And I honestly think that sort of thing is valuable, especially for people who don't know much about poetry. But ultimately, what actually is poetry? Well, frankly, I think if an author writes a piece, and they say it's poetry, then it is poetry. Publications, editors, readers, and even other writers may disagree. And I think voicing their opinions is a good thing, but I don't think anyone should just be writing off poetry by saying, this is not poetry. I don't think that's helpful for anyone. If you come across a poem and it doesn't feel like a poem, explain why. Or, in a similar sense, if you come across a flash fiction story and you think it reads more like a poem, again, explain why. I want to see more of that discourse online. Just remember to be respectful toward everyone's point of view. As Chinky says, language arts isn't a math or a science. Everyone approaches literature with their own unique perspective and writing background, and that's what makes it so amazing. I'll say this again, you might think all of this rings completely hollow coming from the likes of me. And yeah, perhaps I haven't always been specific enough when detailing my gripes with any given poem. Maybe I've been too mean and too dismissive when looking at other people's work. I'm working on it, and I've made a conscious effort about that sort of thing over time. I rely on you folks to let me know if that's ever the case. And to that point, what do you think? Has poetry discourse become too predictable around bad poems? Do you think there's any concrete way to define English language poetry? What did you think of this video? Please tell me everything. As always, I want to take this time to thank my patrons. They make videos like this possible, and I genuinely can't thank them enough. If you like what I do here, you can support me on Patreon too. You'll get access to the community Discord, receive priority review for your work on the second channel, and see videos early. If you don't have cash to spare right now, I totally understand. Doing all the algorithm things really helps too, I assure you. You can also follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft. I've been doing, like, post-credit scenes, I guess, lately in my videos. I don't know what to do for this one, so sorry you stuck around.